Spotlight, lectures and performances on and around Albany State University.
Good evening. Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to the Albany Civil Rights Institute Monthly Community Night. Our speaker tonight is, of course, Dr. Danielle McGuire. Dr. McGuire is an associate professor of history at Wayne State University in Detroit. She attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison and earned her PhD degree in history from Rutgers University. Dr. McGuire is a civil rights historian, and she will be speaking on the role of African American women's resistance to rape and other forms of white male sexual violence before and during the modern civil rights movement. Her presentation tonight is based on her book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. The irony of the role of sexual violence in the civil rights movement is that mainstream media picked up the civil rights movement and some of the inequality matters associated with that, thus giving it national spotlight that has remained until this day. But with that spotlight on civil rights and racial inequality, the issue of sexual violence and harassment that was inflicted on Black women in the South was overlooked and barely mentioned as part of this country's history. Dr. McGuire has made sexuality central to the civil rights movement story, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Danielle McGuire.
Hi, how's everyone tonight? Good, thank you for having me. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me and with each other tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Albany, Georgia, which I'm a little embarrassed to say because I should have been here before because it's such a pivotal place in the history of the civil rights movement. And it's an honor to be here with you tonight. So thank you so much. Thanks especially to Lee Formwalt, who I met back in 2004 and who brought me back here. This is a real pleasure to be able to present my finished work after these many years. So I want to start with a story. In 1944, in Abbeville, Alabama, an African-American woman named Reese Taylor walked home from a church revival. A carload of white men kidnapped her off the street. They drove her to the woods and they gang raped her at gunpoint. And then they dropped her off in the middle of town and they told her if she told anybody what happened, they would kill her. It's a pretty credible threat in 1944. But that night, she found the courage to tell her husband, her father, and the local sheriff the details of the assault. And a few days later, the Montgomery branch of the NAACP called to say they were sending their very best investigator. It was Rosa Parks. It was 11 years before the bus boycott. Rosa Parks came to Abbeville where she had kin, family, cousins, and she took Taylor's testimony. And then she carried Taylor's story back to Montgomery, where she and the city's most militant activists organized the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. And they launched a national movement that the Chicago Defender called the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade. They compared it in scope only to the Scottsboro trials of the 1930s. 11 years later, this group of homegrown activists will become better known as the Montgomery Improvement Association, vaunting its very first president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to international prominence and launching a movement, the bus boycott, that would ultimately change the world. But when this coalition first took root in 1944, Dr. King was just in high school. So the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott is often heralded by historians as the opening scene of the civil rights drama. But I argue that in many ways, it's really one of the last acts of a decades-long struggle to protect Black women like Reese Taylor from sexualized violence and rape. In fact, the kidnapping and rape of Reese Taylor was hardly unusual in the segregated South. From slavery through the better part of the 20th century, white men abducted and assaulted Black women with alarming regularity, with stunning uniformity, and all too often with impunity. They lured black women and girls away from home with promises of work or better wages. They attacked them and harassed them on the job, especially black domestics who were extremely vulnerable in white folks' homes. They attacked them at gunpoint while they're traveling to or from home or work or church or school. And they assaulted them and humiliated them in public spaces, especially on buses and in streetcars. This was the pattern throughout the South during Jim Crow. And it really underscored the limits of Southern justice. But this is the thing that I couldn't help but be excited about when I was doing this research over 12 years, was that black women didn't always keep these stories secret. In fact, from slavery, from the narratives of Harriet Jacobs, to Ida B. Wells, to Fannie Lou Hamer's stark testimony about a forced hysterectomy and sexualized beating in 1963, African American women reclaimed their humanity by organizing public protests and by testifying about their brutal assaults. And those testimonies often led to larger campaigns for civil and human rights. In fact, even the most oft-told and illustrious civil rights campaigns, like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Selma campaign of 1965, or the 1964 Freedom Summer, they often have an unexamined history of gendered political appeals to protect black womanhood from this kind of violence. And so what I do in the book is I argue that rape and resistance to rape actually sits at the center of the African American freedom struggle. So let's talk about that. In most histories of the civil rights movement, most textbooks that people get in school and everything, it begins with the 1955 bus boycott. And according to popular history, who started the boycott? Rosa Parks. And what was it about Miss Parks that made her not want to get out of her seat that night, according to popular history? She was tired. And she was tired. She had foot fatigue, right? Are we really expected to believe that Montgomery, the cradle of the Confederacy, decided to end segregation because a black woman had foot fatigue? I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's useless history. It's a great story, but it's useless history. What's interesting, though, is that when asked the same question, Joe Asbell, who was the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, which was the white newspaper in Montgomery in the 1950s, talked about somebody different. Could you just scoot over a little bit? I'm sorry. I just have to be able to click the computer. Thanks. He talked about somebody named Gertrude Perkins. And this is what he had to say.
Gertrude Perkins is not even mentioned in the history books, but she had as much to do with the bus boycott and its creation as anyone on earth.
Now, Perkins loomed large enough in Asbell's memory nearly 40 years after the fact when he gave this interview to NPR in 1998. And if your initial thought was anything like mine when I first heard this, you're thinking, Gertrude Perkins? Who on earth is Gertrude Perkins? Gertrude Perkins was a 25-year-old African-American woman who was walking home from a party when two white Montgomery police officers kidnapped her off the street, drove her outside of town, and they raped her. This happened in March of 1949. Reverend Solomon Say, an outspoken black minister in Montgomery at the time, had this to say about the event.
Two policemen had picked her up and taken her down on the railroad and had all types of sex relations with her at that particular time. And when they put her out, she came to my door and she told me what had happened to her. I sat down and wrote what she said had happened to her, word by word. When she had finished, I had it notarized and sent it to Drew Pearson in Washington. And Drew Pearson went to the air with it. And when the power structure knew anything here in Montgomery, what Gertrude Perkins said happened to her was all over the nation.
So after she told Reverend Say what happened, they actually went down to the police department and they reported the crime to the police, maybe even the same men who had done this. Of course, the mayor called her claim completely false and accused her of lying. He refused to hold a lineup or issue any warrants. And besides, he said, my policeman wouldn't do a thing like that. But African Americans in Montgomery knew better. The city's police force had a reputation not just for racist brutality, but also for sexist brutality. In 1946, for example, police officers abducted and raped the 16-year-old daughter of a black woman who challenged a police officer on a bus. E.D. Nixon, Reverend Solomon Say, and other African-American activists protested this attack, and they kept it in the public eye. For example, Reverend Vernon Johns, who led the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before Dr. King got there, wrote, "When the rapist is white," on the church marquee. So when Perkins was attacked in 1949, African Americans weren't about to let the police get away with another attack without some kind of major protest. And so they organized. NAACP activists, labor leaders, ministers, members of the Women's Political Council, they formed an umbrella organization called the Citizens Committee for Gertrude Perkins. And they demanded an investigation and a trial. Their public protests lasted for over 2 months. In the process, they exposed the long-standing practices of white police officers sexually assaulting black women. They forced a grand jury hearing. And they brought the city's disparate black ministers together really for the first time. This was really important. It helped to build the infrastructure that African Americans would use during the bus boycott. 2 years later, they organized again in defense of a young African American woman. In February of 1951, a white grocery store owner named Sam Green raped a black teenager named Flossie Hardman. Now, she babysat for the Greens. And when she was finished for the evening, he would often drive her home. Well, one night, instead of taking her home, he drove her to the side of a quiet road and he raped her. She told her parents, and her parents decided to press charges. And after an all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict after deliberating for 5 minutes, they turned to the black community. They reached out to activists like Rufus Lewis and E.D. Nixon and Reverend Say, members of the NAACP and the Women's Political Council, basically the same folks who rallied to defend Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins. And they decided to launch a boycott of Green's grocery store. Since they were the main consumers of his store, they knew that they could put him out of business. And after only a few weeks, they delivered their own guilty verdict by driving Green into the red. They shut him down. The ability to shut down Green's grocery store constituted a major victory. It sent a message, a very compelling message, but it also established the boycott as a powerful weapon for justice, something that Joanne Robinson, the militant leader of the Women's Political Council, would threaten just a couple years later after scores of black women complained about mistreatment and brutality on the city buses. Now, besides police officers, few were as guilty of these crimes against black women as were the city's bus drivers, who bullied and brutalized black women daily. They carried blackjacks and guns, and they assaulted and sometimes even killed African Americans who refused to abide by the racial order of Jim Crow. In 1953 alone, African Americans filed over 30 complaints of abuse and mistreatment on the city's buses, and most of these complaints came from black women who were domestics, who had no choice but to take the bus from the white side of town to the black side of town and back every single day. They didn't have cars, and so the buses were the bane of their existence because the buses were sites of violence. They complained that drivers hurled nasty sexualized insults at them, that they touched them inappropriately and physically abused them. One woman remembered bus drivers sexually assaulting her and harassing her as she waited on the corner. The bus was up high, she said, and the street was down low. They'd drive up and expose themselves while I was just standing there, she said. It scared me to death. Another remembered that bus drivers treated black women, quote, just as rough as can be, like we are some kind of animal. Another woman said bus drivers like to talk under folks' clothes. Women walked, Rosa Parks said in 1956, not in support of her, but because she said, I was not the only person who was mistreated or humiliated. Other women, she said, had gone through similarly shameful experiences, most worse than mine. It was these experiences that propelled African American women into every conceivable aspect of the boycott. They were the boycott's chief negotiators and strategists. They helped staff the elaborate carpool system that kept people moving from one place to the other. They raised most of the local money for the movement, mostly by selling chicken dinners and savory sandwiches to white folks downtown during lunch hour. And they took that money back to mass meeting on Wednesday and Sundays. And they filled the majority of the pews at the mass meetings. If you look at any photo of the civil rights movement, especially Montgomery, but almost any campaign in the modern struggle, pay attention to who's in the photographs. It's almost always women, majority women. They use these mass meetings to testify publicly about the abuse and mistreatment they received on the buses every single day. And of course, they walked for over a year. They protested humiliation and reclaimed their bodies by demanding the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And so while the bus boycott is often portrayed as a spontaneous movement, Rosa Parks had tired feet, or, she just decided that day that she was going to stay seated, or that it's led primarily by ministers, I think it's important to know that the bus boycott has a past, and that it's rooted in the struggle to protect and defend black womanhood from racial and sexual violence, and that in that sense, it's almost impossible for us to understand and situate the boycott in its proper historical context without understanding the stories of Reese Taylor and Gertrude Perkins and Flossie Hardman and all of the other women who were mistreated on the buses. In fact, without understanding these stories, this history, I think it's hard for us to even understand why so many women were willing to put their lives on the line to end segregation and protest abuse on the buses. But Montgomery wasn't the only place in which attacks on black women fueled protests against white supremacy and for the protection of black womanhood. Civil rights campaigns in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Daisy Bates, the heroine of the Little Rock school desegregation movement, argued that the rape and murder of her mother fueled her interest in justice. Throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, she used her newspaper to expose and publicly shame white men who assaulted black women, and then used those stories to push protests against these men and to try to bring them to justice. Or here in Albany, Georgia, in 1962, where local people organized to defend black women at Albany State College from white men who were alleged to have frequently broke into black women's dorms and prowled around campus at night looking for women to attack. Those students would go on to lead the Albany movement. Or Mississippi in the 1964 Freedom Summer, where black women who were arrested for doing voter registration work were sent to prison, and in prison they were sexually assaulted and harassed. All of these major campaigns have roots in the organized resistance to sexualized violence and to demands for the protection of black womanhood. And yet, most histories of the civil rights movement provide no analyses of rape or sexual violence, even as stories of violence against men, like Goodman and Schwerner and Cheney or Emmett Till, provide gripping examples of racist brutality. And so I think that if we're really going to understand the civil rights movement, then we need to understand these stories. We need to listen to black women's testimonies. Now, we know that this history is rooted in slavery, that the sexual exploitation of black women had its roots there. Slave owners' stolen access to black women's bodies strengthened their political, their social, and their economic power for, I think, really simply two reasons. One is that colonial laws made the offspring of slave women the property of their master, giving slave owners a financial incentive to impregnate black women. And two, colonial laws that banned interracial marriage, but not fornication or childbirth out of wedlock, awarded white men exclusive sexual access to white women, while denying black women the respectability and rights garnered by a legal relationship. And you see this especially in inheritance, right? Wealth passed through marriage. But if you have children out of wedlock, or you have relationships out of wedlock, you don't get any of that wealth. These laws created a system that allowed white men to police white women's sexual and marital choices and sexually abuse black women with impunity, both of which maintained their position atop a racial and economic hierarchy. And when slavery fell, these laws and the practices that went with them remained. For example, during Reconstruction, former slaveholders and their sympathizers used violence and terror to reassert control over freed people. And rape became a weapon of terror. And interracial rape, or the concept of it, became the battleground upon which black men and women fought for ownership and control of their own bodies. So, while black women were the primary victims of interracial rape during this period, the idea of interracial rape was deployed by whites as a justification to lynch black men. In order to maintain power, whites created this myth of the black beast rapist, portraying black men as the mythological incubus, this beast that swoops down on white women and attacks them while they're sleeping. And they use this myth whenever they fear losing power. For example, white Democrats in North Carolina played on whites' fear of the incubus in 1900 to regain political control after a biracial fusion party took every single statewide office in 1896. The political tactic of creating this fear of the incubus, of creating this fear of black men as a rapist, continued throughout the 20th century. In the 1940s, African American men used to joke that the closer they got to a ballot box, the more whites thought they looked like a rapist. And we see this especially after the Supreme Court issued the 1954 Brown decision ordering the integration of public schools. Because for most segregationists, integration almost always meant miscegenation, right? Or, as Mississippi judge and founder of the White Citizens Council, Tom Brady, put it in his little book, amalgamation. America has its choice, he said. Headlines in Citizens Council newspapers warned whites in 1954 that the incubus was coming. Mixed marriage, sex orgies, and so-called accounts of black men raping white girls were, quote, typical of stories filtering back from areas where racial integration is proceeding with all deliberate speed. Here's a Citizens Council leader actually espousing these very theories in the mid-1950s.
Don't you ever give up that gun. That's all you got left to protect that little baby in that crib. Because these dirty devils will be in your home. That's what they want. They do not want equality. You know they don't want equality. They don't want something like you got. They want what you got, your women.
Because segregationists employed these sexual scare tactics to oppose Brown, to oppose integration, and to cultivate fear and resentment toward any kind of integration, any racial or gender impropriety on the part of African Americans could be seen as threatening the racial status quo. That's why African Americans in Montgomery chose the more respectable Rosa Parks as the symbol of segregation instead of the many other black women who could have very easily filled that role. And I believe it's why they downplayed her militancy and her history as an anti-rape activist. But I also think it's historians' focus on respectability and silence that has ignored what black women had been testifying about for decades. As a result, I think historians, and in that sense the general public, has missed really important milestones in the modern civil rights movement. For example, the arrest, trial, and conviction of 4 white men for raping Betty Jean Owens, a black college student in Tallahassee, Florida, in the spring of 1959. This was a watershed event. Owens' testimony focused national attention on the sexual exploitation of black women at the hands of white men. When an all-white jury finally handed down a life sentence, it not only broke with Southern tradition, but it fractured the philosophical and political foundations of white supremacy by challenging the relationship between sexual domination and racial inequality. For perhaps the first time since Reconstruction, African Americans could imagine state power being used in defense of their manhood and womanhood. Betty Jean Owens' grandmother recognized the importance and historic nature of this verdict. "I've lived to see the day," she said, "where white men really would be brought to trial for what they've done." And then the Tallahassee case led to convictions elsewhere that summer, 1959, in Montgomery, Alabama, in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in Burton, South Carolina, where a white Marine actually received the death penalty for raping a black woman. I should add a footnote here in that the death penalty was overturned on appeal. I have yet to find one white man who received the death penalty for raping a black woman during this time period, even though black men were on death row or were murdered for lesser crimes. But in each case that summer, 1959, in Montgomery, in Raleigh, in Burton, South Carolina, in each of those cases, white supremacy faltered in the face of the courageous testimony of black women who often stood in Jim Crow courtrooms and testified on their own behalf. John McCrae, the editor of the South Carolina Lighthouse and Informer, a black newspaper, wondered if these convictions pointed to a new day. "This forced intimacy," he said, "goes back to the days of slavery when our women were the chattel property of white men. Are we now witnessing the arrival of our women?" he asked. "Are they at long last gaining the emancipation they've needed?" John McCrae recognized that freedom was meaningless unless you had ownership of your own body. Desegregation and equality meant little if you could not walk through the world without being molested. As Ella Baker put it in 1960 after the sit-ins, the freedom struggle, she said, was about more than access to public accommodations. It was, she said, bigger than a hamburger. A 1965 case in Hattiesburg, Mississippi was another milestone that historians have missed. But a little background first. In the months before SNCC sent black and white volunteers streaming into Mississippi for the Freedom Summer of 1964, segregationists in Mississippi armed themselves for what they called a sexual invasion. They prepared to meet what they called the Army of Amalgamation with violence if necessary. They armed themselves. They had a tank patrolling the streets. They were ready. But if they were worried about illicit integration, they ought to have been focusing their wrath on white men who had been attacking black women in Mississippi for a long, long time. Here's a clip, for example, of Indisha Ida Mae Holland speaking about black women's and girls' special vulnerability in the Magnolia State.
I went to babysit for this white family, and the white woman called me upstairs. I went on upstairs in a hurry so as not to keep the white woman waiting. she said, Mr. Lawrence wants to see you. And I looked in the bed. Mr. Lawrence was laying there among the bedclothes. They were so silky. And I said, yes, sir, Mr. Lawrence, what you want with me? And he immediately pulled me down into the bed and had intercourse with me. I was 11 years old that day. It was my birthday. It was no reason for us to run and tell our mother or our father because they couldn't do anything about it, but get killed if they said something about it. So many times, we girls would talk in the bathroom about it. You know, never telling our parents, but it happened very, very frequent.
And this kind of thing, you know, it affected all kinds of people. It left more than physical scars. It left deep psychological wounds for men and for women.
I hated it. I had all kind of fantasies about, I was fascinated by people like David and Goliath stories. These are my favorite biblical characters, the cats who kicked folks' butt. I liked Moses drowning everybody in the Red Sea. I used to go in the woods. I used to go in the backwoods and preach and scream, fight them, run into bushes and hit trees and pretend they was white folk.
So you learn how to negotiate your life with white folks. And I guess you also learn the fear associated with them of how much power they actually held over you, how they could determine whether you continue to live or whether you died.
The reality of that is what made me so shocked to find stories of black women who refused to remain silent about these kinds of crimes. Because I think that probably for every 10 women that this happened to, 9 out of those 10 would probably keep it to themselves. But there was always that one who would talk, who would tell somebody about what happened. And after more than 2 decades of black women's testimony in Mississippi and community efforts to protect them from this kind of violence, an all-white jury finally sentenced Norman Cannon, a 19-year-old white man, for raping a black teenager in 1965. Major newspapers hailed the conviction as unprecedented and a sign that even Mississippi was finally making some real changes. Now this case, the Norman Cannon case, this is the only instance that I found where a white man who received a life sentence actually served a life sentence. He appealed in 2000 to get out of jail, and they denied his appeal. And as far as I know, he died in prison. Or he's still there. I can't find a record of him, but he's not out in Mississippi. His appeal was denied. But almost all the other cases, the men were released early. Like the Montgomery movement, the 1965 Selma campaign has an important history of sex and sexual violence that historians have not really fully explored. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act left segregationists reeling. They were angry. They were on the defensive. And the staunchest supporters of white supremacy used the fear of interracial sex to resuscitate and to revive Jim Crow. In other words, they called on the incubus. They used a kind of sexual McCarthyism to discredit the Voting Rights Act and to defame the demonstrators who risked their lives on the Selma to Montgomery March. For example, white police and authority figures, including state congressman William Dickinson, said that they saw SNCC leaders engaging in public sex, that volunteers camping overnight were involved in mass orgies, and that during the march, black men were constantly exposing themselves and fondling white women. And so now the civil rights activists were no longer just outside agitators or communists. Now they were sexual fiends, intent on spreading a culture of depravity around the country. It's within this storm, and because of it, that the Ku Klux Klan murdered Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit, who defied racial and gender mores by embracing the black freedom struggle. It was her detractors, the Klan mostly, who accused her of embracing black men. Now, if we incorporate these analyses of sex and sexual violence into well-known civil rights narratives, we're going to change the historical markers of the movement. So while the Voting Rights Act is often considered the bookend of the civil rights movement, I think that one of the last legal barriers to black women's bodily integrity actually fell in 1967 when the Supreme Court overturned laws prohibiting interracial marriage in the landmark Loving versus Virginia decision of 1967. In fact, the ban on interracial marriage was one of the last vestiges of slavery to fall. But only by placing the Loving decision within this long struggle for black women's bodily integrity and freedom from racial and sexual terror can it properly be recognized as part of the civil rights movement. Now, one of the questions I always had throughout this whole struggle was whether or not a black woman would have the right to defend herself from white sexual violence, with violence if necessary. And that question was tested in the trial of Joanne Little in 1975. Joanne Little was a petite, 20-year-old African-American woman from Beaufort, North Carolina. Little Washington, it's in Beaufort County. She's from Washington, North Carolina. One night in August of 1974, Clarence Olligood, the white jailer, who was 62 years old, entered her cell. And he came with an ice pick. And he tried to rape her. She got that ice pick away from him and she stabbed him to death. And then she ran. North Carolina put her on trial for murder. And as Little prepared for her murder trial, a broad coalition of supporters, from the National Organization of Women to the Black Panther Party, rallied to her defense. Like the 1944 Campaign for Equal Justice for Mrs. Recy Taylor, the Free Joanne Little movement was led primarily by black women, including, as it turns out, Mrs. Rosa Parks, who headed the Detroit chapter of the Free Joanne Little campaign. At her trial, prosecutors tried to paint Miss Little as a typical Jezebel. They said that she actually wanted to have sex with the jailer, that she lured him in there and then killed him as part of an elaborate ploy to escape. This was a stereotype that, of course, was rooted in slavery. Little's attorney, on the other hand, fit her story into a much longer and more painful history. He read to the jury a long passage from an African-American woman's 1902 essay decrying their special vulnerability in a system where white men could abuse them with impunity. By reading this passage aloud and pointing to the past, Little's attorney bore witness to the decades of abuse that black women faced during slavery and Jim Crow, but he also pointed to this long-standing tradition of testimony. After deliberating for over an hour, the jury unanimously voted to acquit Joanne Little. As the jury foreman read the verdict, Little broke into sobs at the defense table as her lawyers clustered around her. Wiping away the tears and, maybe channeling John McCrae, who wondered in 1959 if African-American women had finally achieved emancipation, she said, "It feels good to be free." This cartoon in the Baltimore Afro-American hailed the verdict as a major victory. Here, Little's portrayed as a champion boxer, standing atop a battered and bruised Jim Crow. Hoisting Little's gloved fists up into the air, her attorneys proclaimed victory for their champ and a triumph over Dixie racism. With stars swirling around his head, looking pretty tired and, kind of overweight in those old Confederate flag shorts, at least in this case, old Jim Crow is down for the count. If we are going to fully understand the role of gender, of sexuality in the civil rights movement, if we are going to understand or provide what Nell Irvin Painter calls a fully loaded cost accounting of slavery and segregation, then we have to include these stories of sexual violence and rape, of testimony and protest that remain at the volatile core of the modern civil rights movement. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions.
I would ask that when you ask your question, if you could repeat it
Sure.
for our camera.
It's always hard to be the first person to ask a question.
I'll take the honor, privilege. My name is Eddie Coley, down here for Albany State's homecoming. But I was very interested in that quote that you had at the beginning of the program. The word that really stuck with me is principle.
Mm-hmm.
Principle. Could you comment, please?
Yeah, I mean, that was Gunnar Myrdal, and he wrote that in 1944. And he thought that as he attempted to understand white supremacy and how it had invaded and infected every institution in the United States, he thought that the animating principle,
Yes.
that the animating structure that controlled white supremacy, or that white supremacy was rooted in, was sex. And what I try to do is flesh that out a little bit. What did he mean by that? And what I think he meant by that was that it infected everything, so that slavery is based on the complete domination of black women and black men's bodies. And that slavery was advanced and continued through the sexual exploitation of black women.
That's a very powerful statement.
Yeah.
Very, very
Yes.
powerful statement.
I agree. It is a very powerful statement. And I think that it's a statement that has been overlooked, that we tended to look at just racial violence and racial brutality as if it wasn't related to anything else. And in that sense, by only focusing on racial violence, we took away the gendered aspects of it.
When you
And
say principle, principle, that's deep.
it is.
Thank you.
It is. Thank you. And you know what's so fascinating about it is that at the same time that segregationists were railing against interracial sex, they're busy having it. But that's because they gained power and control from it. They use it as a weapon, and they use it as a weapon in different ways. Rape becomes a weapon of terror. And then the use or the fear of black men being rapists becomes a political weapon and a weapon of terror. And so, these weapons are deployed throughout American history in order to maintain white supremacy. And so you're right, it is the principle upon which the structure is based. It's not the only principle. Obviously racial supremacy is one other principle, but it's definitely one of the, I think, the more animating structures that inform the policies, practices. You're welcome.
Can you do something for me?
Sure.
In modern times, the new catchword is sexual harassment.
Uh-huh.
How does this struggle for African American women plug into the larger struggle for women in general? Because you bring that into the 1970s, of course,
Right.
the feminist movement
Right.
is, running hot and heavy. And so
Right.
how does that play out to connect that in?
So the question is, how basically does black women struggle for bodily integrity and struggle against sexual harassment, to free themselves from sexual harassment, play out in the larger struggle in the United States for women's rights, essentially? And I think that black women laid the foundation, that it's black women's protest and black women's struggle against these things that actually enable white women to pick up the baton and carry it forward. Except I don't think white women ever really acknowledged it. That part of the reason why white women were able to speak out about sexual violence in the 1970s and had these speak outs, these anti-rape movements, is because black women had been doing this for a long, long time. And so they had footsteps they could follow in. And so I think that they're totally connected. And I think black women had been struggling for women's rights, whether it was the right to vote or the right to bodily integrity, in many ways before white women, and white women learned their lessons from black women without acknowledging them. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. McGuire, I want to commend you on your work.
Thank you.
Not only the 12-year struggle toward the PhD and this writing and so on, but I also want to ask you something about contributing work or others having done this. This seems to be cutting edge to me. I had never heard of, for example, the incubuses coming. I'd never heard of these things. And I thought that I was a scholar, but obviously not a historian. And I've always been interested in the movement and related issues. But tell me about, are there others who have done such work as you have done or who've attempted to do that?
The question is, are there others who have written about this topic and who have attempted to do this? And the answer is yes and no. So a lot of the ideas that I had for looking at the movement in a different way came from scholars of the colonial period and the slavery period. Because I think there's some really good work being done on sexuality and sexual violence during slavery and during the colonial period that has everything to do with race and racial control. So some of that work just hadn't really, those ideas hadn't filtered up to the civil rights movement yet, I think, and I took it there. Black women novelists have been writing about sexual violence for a long time. And so certainly they have set the standard and set the example. But I couldn't find any historical documentation of this kind of violence within the literature of the civil rights movement, even though it was sort of a truism in my history classes and among older African Americans that this happened all the time. It happened with quite, with somewhat regularity. And so what I try to do is just document it and find the records of this existing. And those records are everywhere, and these stories are everywhere, And everywhere I go, people tell me more stories. So the things that I captured, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. The stories that I was able to document were only the stories that made it to the newspapers and to the courts, that only made it public in a big way. And so I'm sure that some of you have stories here that you know about that never got into the newspapers, but may have been talked about within families or within neighborhoods. I'm sure many of you were taught lessons by your parents on how to protect yourselves from these kinds of attacks. And that's part of that history.
My mother's grandmother was a slave, and although they were reared at a time when it was very special rearing, the King's English and so on, and she became a teacher and all this. But mother had a severe fear and sort of hatred for what she had learned about her grandmother. And she'd tell us from time to time what had happened. She grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, had been born in New York. But mother said there were such horrible things that went on, but these things were never really picked up by the community or newspapers or so on. And she had a very fine person, but these things that were talked about. And I always wondered, Mother, how is it that you so deeply distrust and have such a horrible feeling? But Mother must have experienced in her grandmother and the stories. It must have been horrible.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just in Jacksonville, Florida. So
That's right.
Thank you very much for bringing this to the light.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was struck when you were talking about incubus and really all throughout your discussion of the black women having to fight against this attack. And I was wondering, because you reminded me of Soul and Ice, Eldridge Cleaver, where he seems to be one of the few black male writers of the time period in civil rights who really got that it was all about sexuality and the emasculated white man trying to attack this black figure. My question really is, though, that in the black female consciousness, they were being called all sorts of things, and I wondered, you talked about incubus for the men. In your research, have you come across them talking about how they had to take their bodies back from like the Hottentot myth, or just like this sort of androgynous myth, the matriarchal myth, that they're just all sort of just this mother figure.
Right, asexual. It's either hypersexual or asexual.
Right, and then also, another question is are there any other black male writers of that time period that seem to get it like Cleaver, just out of curiosity?
Well, there were a number of African American men who talked about this and who were outraged by it and who, advocated armed resistance to it.
But like really got the whole thing was about it. That's what Cleaver seems to get.
I think there are probably a number of men who do, but they may not have, talked about it with historians, because historians tend to not ask about these things. But one person who really spoke about it during the time period, who made it very clear that sex is the defining principle around which this is all working, is Robert Williams, the militant NAACP activist of Monroe, North Carolina, who fought to protect young African American men in Monroe, North Carolina. Hanover Thompson and Fuzzy Simpson, 2 boys, 8 and 10 years old, who were locked up for allegedly giving a little white girl a kiss on the cheek during a playground game. They were locked up. And Robert Williams made an international case out of it. And drew attention to the United States during the Cold War and the ridiculousess of a state locking up 2 little boys. That's how obsessed they were with sex. And interracial sex, that you hadn't even gone through puberty. It was preposterous. But there was a lynch mob ready for those boys. Because, right. So Robert Williams, I think, was really good at it. James Baldwin, in this interview in Virginia in the 1950s, Kilpatrick, who is a pretty well-known white editor of the newspaper in Virginia, said, I don't mind if you guys come to our schools or we integrate the lunch counters. I just don't want you to marry my daughter. And James Baldwin said, marry your daughter? He said, I've been marrying your daughter since slavery. You don't want me to marry your wife's daughter. Okay, so he got it very clearly. And he, said that publicly on television. Stokely Carmichael said in the late 1960s, 1966, the Moynihan Report had come out basically blaming black poverty on black women and a maternal society. And Stokely Carmichael said that we're not in this bag because of my mama, he said. We're in this bag because what you did to my mama. So I think that there is a very clear understanding of the way in which this functioned, but it's been left out of the narrative of the civil rights movement because I don't think people saw sex as part of a civil rights struggle. And I think, frankly, that many historians were afraid to ask people these questions because they don't want to hurt them. They don't want to dredge up painful topics. These kinds of things resonate for decades. And it's not just the victims who are angered and devastated by these things, but it's their family members and their kin. And, so the effects ripple out for generations, I think. And so historians have been, I think, reluctant to wade into that and ask people to wade into it with them. But I found that people are willing to talk if they trust you and if you ask these questions,
That leads to a question. As a white female historian, why do you think there have not been any African American or black female historians that have documented this?
Well, I don't think that that's true that black women haven't documented it. I just think that nobody has taken it and put it all in one place. So, one of the most important women in even giving us the chance to consider this is Darlene Clark Hine, who is a black professor of history. And she was at Michigan State, and I don't know where she is now. But she wrote an article 25 years ago or so about the Great Migration. And she said that one of the reasons why women were eager to migrate from the South to the North was because of the threat of sexual violence. And so she asked us to consider this as a factor in motivating exodus, from the South. And she always promised to go into it more, but she never really did. She had other things she was working on. But one of the things that she said was that part of the reason why we didn't know this was because black women had a culture of dissemblance. They had a culture of silence around this subject. And I think that that's true. And I think what happened, though, is that historians read Dr. Hines' article and said, oh, black women don't want to talk about this, so I'm not going to ask, because it's a culture of silence. So then historians adopted a culture of silence also. And what I found was that if you break the silence, that people will break it with you, and you get some of those stories. Now, there will always be people for whom silence serves to protect their most inner secrets and their soul. And I totally respect that. Silence is beneficial that way. But there were other women who used testimony as a way to not only assert their personhood, but to heal, right? To deflect the shame, to put the shame where it belonged, on the white men who were their assailants, instead of shouldering it. So I think that there are black women who've done this already. Like I said, I think black women novelists really paved the way. But you know, there are women like Deborah Gray White who wrote about black women slaves' experience. And so, you know, I mean, I'm standing on the shoulders of black women scholars who laid the foundation. Yeah. We wouldn't be here without them. I wouldn't be here without them.
Very interesting. It's very interesting.
And I always say, and I don't mean this like flippantly, but I'm a child of black power. Because I went to the University of Wisconsin and I went through the Afro-American Studies department that only existed because of the Black Power movement. Had there not been a Black Power movement, there wouldn't have been an Afro-American Studies department to begin with. I don't think they ever intended that little white girls would come and take their classes and end up teaching black history. But you know, that's sort of what happened, with me anyway. And so, you know, that's an important history to recognize. I didn't make this up, you know. Yes, ma'am.
How do you think the principle is playing out today?
Well, how do I think the principle of, you know, sex animating the structure of white supremacy is playing out? I think we see the incubus rearing its ugly head quite often. The last time I saw it, you know, with ferocity was during Katrina. Although you see it here and there all the time. But in terms of a national sort of recognition of the incubus. Remember when everyone was stuck in the Superdome and the news reporters were like, there are gangs of rapists running around attacking women. Do you remember? And there was never any gangs of rapists. I mean, but the media ran with that story because they knew that story. Because that had been ingrained in their minds and in their culture. And, you know, so if they heard that from anybody, it rang true. And they ran with it. And there was never a gang of black rapists attacking people. That was the incubus. You know, this African immigrant woman in New York just recently, the maid, the help, who accused Dominique Strauss-Kahn of attacking her in his, you know, $4,000 a night hotel room. What's interesting is that almost immediately everyone rallied around her because they knew that story was true too. But then the old habits of turning her into a Jezebel, into a liar, into a criminal, you know, in order to deflect attention from the real crime, they put it all on her, and she suddenly became a disreputable victim.
And the DNA proved it.
And so then they dropped the case, and then Dominique Strauss-Kahn goes home and admits that he had a moral failure. You know, so he admits that he did it. But nobody talked about the fact that this guy was a lecher. And that he had done this to women before that. Why were we focused on her reputation and not his reputation? Why? Because this is our history. So I think that although I don't think white men are able to get away with attacking black women like they used to be able to. So I think things have changed, but I think that those dynamics are still with us. And I think, I mean, look, you know, Anita Hill just celebrated the 20th anniversary of what happened with her and Clarence Thomas. Now, you know, Thomas played a role in that, but it was the white senators who really devastated her credibility and used stereotypes of black women to, you know, to dismiss her claims. So I mean, I'm sure y'all could tell me more about that than I could tell you, you know. But that's what I see as a white woman looking at it, you know, with this history in my head.
This is a heavy narrative,
Yeah.
of course. And, you know, just listening and hearing, it was really difficult for me to listen to this.
because I think that my concern with this is how do you create this narrative for us to deal with the sanitized version of life that we seem to be living. It seemed to me that it was almost surreal listening to this, and yet somehow we still live in a very sanitized, for instance, our historical teaching in our schools, K through 12, let alone our higher ed, does not tell us the suffering of our African American women and how they bear the brunt of the same supremacy that's going on in our geopolitical literally right now. And I wonder a lot, how is it that we're going, I mean, it's somehow we're living in a fantasy world here in our country.
It's post-racial, haven't you heard? No. We don't have a problem with race anymore. No, I know it is. I know it is. And I don't mean to be flippant. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be flippant. But that's the attitude that people have, that somehow, since electing Barack Obama, we just don't have a race problem anymore, which is preposterous and ridiculous.
I want to know how we as a society, as a historian, because as a teacher, you know, many teachers in here, how are we going to carry this forward to the larger, because, you know, we have many books. I read a lot of books, a lot of white papers. I'm not sure that the larger body is going to have this, and yet somehow our media, as I shared, I think the main thing is our educational system. We have a sanitized version of our lives being given to us. This is what I think is our fundamental problem.
I agree.
And I'd love to know how do you use this narrative, and how do you think that this needs to be used? Because you know, we go to a lot of things, and yet it doesn't seem like it's permeating for us, and it's almost like a surreal, because this is heavy.
Yeah.
This is heavy.
I think we ought to also thank Lee Fomward and this institute as well. I'm sorry, I just had to
the spaces where we can have these conversations. But I think you're right, and I think this just goes back to the way that Rosa Parks is portrayed in history in many ways, because Rosa Parks is portrayed as this old, tired seamstress whose tired feet animated her political decision that day. But Rosa Parks is the granddaughter of Garveyites. You know, she organized Voters League meetings in the 1940s. She helped defend the Scottsboro Boys in armed meetings. You know, they had armed meetings in Alabama in the 1930s, her and her husband, to raise money and defend the Scottsboro Boys. And by turning her into the kind of the Madonna of Montgomery, I think that we have de-radicalized her, and we've de-radicalized the movement. And I think that there's a political reason for that. I don't think that the powers that be, the Texas school board people who basically write all the textbooks for us, want young people to be as radical as the real Rosa Parks. I don't think they want young people to understand how real change is made in a democracy. I don't think they, you know, because otherwise they wouldn't teach the movement as if it were a spontaneous decision about, you know, sore toes and great speeches.
Well, I have an African-American first lady now, so I'm trying to get to the now. I mean, you know, in terms of the history, you know, this is the historical documentation.
Right.
My question was about how do we narrate, how do you see that we as a society are going to use our historical documentation to go forward? I mean, I have an African-American first lady that they said was radical.
Right.
Who went to Princeton.
I know.
Is a Harvard lawyer, and somehow is looked upon as being aggressive, or so. I'm trying to get to the now.
I think that we have to be honest about our history, and we have to tell these stories. And until we're honest about it, we can't move out of the past. We can't embrace the future. And so, for example, one of the ways this book I think has made a difference is that a young woman heard the story of Reese Taylor. And she found out that she was still alive. Reese Taylor will be 91 on December 31st. And she lives in Florida. Her whole family's still in Abbeville. And in May, the Alabama state legislature passed a resolution formally apologizing to Reese Taylor. The state actually admitted its complicity in allowing her assailants to go free, and admitted that they hadn't done enough to investigate her case. So, I mean, you know, that's important. It's an important recognition of her humanity. Is it justice? No. But it is an important step. And so I wrote the book so that we could move that conversation forward and so that we could have these kinds of truth and reconciliation committees, so that we could bring the horrible nature of the past into the present, so that we could come to terms with it, so that we could be honest about it, and that we could then move forward as a people. But I don't think we can do that until we start telling these stories. And, we need to demand more out of our textbooks, and we need to demand more out of our schools, I think.
I apologize, but I have to leave. Could I leave my book with you?
Yes.
Phone ball and have them
Sure.
have the autograph?
Of course.
I'll leave that.
Okay.
Have to leave.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed
It's nice
it.
to meet you.
I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm interested, what became of Joan? Is it Joan or Joanne Little?
It's Joanne.
What became of her after her triumph over Dixon Justice?
Now, it's really funny you should ask me that, because last Friday, I was speaking in Detroit at the Hartford Memorial Baptist Church for their social justice conference, and who should walk into the church in Detroit but Miss Joanne Little? She took a bus 20 hours from New York, where she lives, to come see me. I had never interviewed her for the book. I couldn't find her. I looked and looked and looked. I talked to people. I did everything a person could do to find somebody without, filing a missing persons report or something.
Did she say to you how she found out about you?
She was looking up some information about one of her former attorneys, William Kunstler, and she Googled his name and my name came up. So she discovered that I wrote this book and then wanted to find me. And she did.
So really, what became of her?
So she became a nurse in New York. She served some time in prison after the acquittal, because she had escaped from prison from a term for theft. And so she needed to fulfill that sentence. So she went to women's prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then she escaped from that prison. And she went to New York, and they found her. And they found her with some unsavory characters. And so that she was arrested again, and she served time at Rikers Island. And she was released. And then she went to school, and she got a degree, and now she's a nurse. And she was laughing. She said, she goes, now they give me the jail key, because she works with young people who are moving through the incarceration system and who are psychologically damaged. And they send her to talk to them because she's been through it. But she was kind of snickering about that. She's like, half of them don't even know what happened. She's like, but they took my fingerprints, so they should have known if they had a question. But she was acquitted after all, She said that for many years there was a gag order, and she couldn't talk about what happened. That was part of the trial, and that the gag order is done, and she's ready to start talking again. So I'm going to interview her next month, and there's a larger history there for her too, and I didn't cover all of it. I just mostly focused on that story. Right, right. Her whole family was basically harassed out of Washington, North Carolina. There's one person remaining, but all the rest of her siblings, they all moved up north. They couldn't stay there. Her brother came with her, Malcolm Little. Does that name sound familiar? They're cousins, actually.
So when you ask why more black women are not willing or were not willing to come forward with them, that's the answer.
Right. No, it was very difficult. It was very dangerous. It was almost impossible, but there were some who did it. And so, Betty Jean Owens, for example, who testified in a segregated courtroom in Tallahassee in 1959 against her 4 assailants, she did so at great risk, but she did it. And it made a huge difference. She still lives in Tallahassee. She's in her early 60s. And she talked to the Tallahassee newspaper in February for the first time in 52 years. And she said this history, putting her case into context, meant something to her because she always saw it as just something that happened to her. She never saw what she did as part of a larger struggle. And so she said seeing it that way had liberated her in a way, which moved me profoundly because she'd always sort of been my angel. Of course, she never knew that, but. So the history makes a difference. It's important. Yes, ma'am.
You will be writing more in the future.
I will be. I don't know on what yet, but I will be. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Tied into some of the other questions that we've heard tonight, are you aware of any community-based outreach organizations that either help to spread the news about this or even run maybe an oral history program to talk to those who are comfortable and willing to share their stories?
There's lots of oral history programs. There's lots of civil rights historians who are looking for people's stories. There's a wonderful historian right here in Albany who's doing work on the Albany movement and who needs people to interview. I think that as a story becomes more public, that people should feel more comfortable telling all of the details of the story. You know, all the things that were part of the struggle for human rights. This is not just about civil rights, it's about human rights. And there are lots of ways that white supremacy denigrated humanity. You know, Martin Luther King talked about the way segregation and white supremacy conspire to turn people into things. The thingification of white supremacy, said. And that's something that I think the movement fought against. And so that's all part of it. So, and there are lots of organizations now that are working to help African American women and girls who are survivors of sexual violence, and there's this problem continues, and there are lots of organizations, I'm sure local as well as national, that people could give something to if they were interested. There's a wonderful organization in Chicago called A Long Walk Home, for example, that really focuses on black girls. And helping them out of these kinds of situations. That's one that I know and support.
I want to thank Danielle McGuire for this incredible
Thanks.
evening.
Thank you.